It's a situation that I don't think can last under the current path that we are on right now, and something's going to break, whether it emanates from the BRICS or from within, and whether it's intended or not, I think the day of reckoning is coming.
On the Spot with Michelle Makori is brought to you by Swan Bitcoin.
Hello, I'm Michelle Makori. Thank you for joining us. As of January 1st, the BRICS group has officially expanded its size and influence with the addition of 5 new members. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Egypt, Iran, and Ethiopia have now joined Brazil, Russia, China, India, and South Africa to make up the new BRICS Plus. Argentina was also invited to join following last year's summit in South Africa, but has declined under the leadership of newly elected Javier Milei. Meanwhile, Russia has now taken over the BRICS presidency, following on from South Africa's chairmanship in 2023. Russia will hold the chair for this year and will host the BRICS annual summit in Kazan in October. And President Putin says he plans to increase the BRICS role in the international financial system. Now, the group has made it clear that one of its primary objectives is to move away from reliance on the US dollar and to trade in its own currencies. Brazil's president has called for BRICS nations to adopt a common currency for trade and investment between each other. And that's an idea that's been warmly embraced by Moscow and expected to be a big focus of this year's summit in Russia. 30 more countries have also expressed interest in joining the alliance in 2024. Now, as it stands now, BRICS Plus represents over 3.5 billion people, or 45% of the world's population. The collective gross domestic product, or GDP, of the group exceeds $28.5 trillion, or about 28% of the global economy. And the BRICS Plus countries also produce 44% of the world's crude oil. Well, my next guest says that he expects the expanded alliance to accelerate the collapse of the petrodollar and ultimately lead to the demise of the dollar as the global reserve currency. And he sees the bifurcation of the global monetary system intensifying in 2024, with the Western system being challenged by a growing coalition finding safety in numbers. Andy Schectman is the president and owner of Miles Franklin Precious Metals. He has over 3 decades of experience in the precious metal sector and is a well-regarded expert on monetary history and on the economy. Andy, welcome back to Kitco. Good to see you, and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, Michelle. It's great to be back. Thanks for having me.
And it's great to have you. Hopefully it will be a Happy New Year, but not if what you're saying does in fact materialize this year, Andy. That will certainly put a major dent in it for many people. Now, Andy, you have long warned that we will see a change in the dollar-denominated money order. In fact, the first time we spoke was January of last year, of 2023. And you warned that the trend to de-dollarize was accelerating, especially following the sanctions imposed on Russia after its invasion of Ukraine, including banning Moscow from the international SWIFT system and what many have called the weaponization of the dollar. And since then, Andy, a lot has happened, including this expansion of the BRICS and member countries formalizing trade agreements, not using the dollar, but their own currencies instead. We've even had non-member countries like France ditching the dollar in trade deals. French companies completed 2 natural gas deals with China, paid for entirely in yuan last year. And perhaps most significantly, we're seeing oil sold in other currencies. Oil's been sold in rubles and rupees and dirham. JP Morgan Chase has estimated that about 20% of the world's oil was bought and sold in other countries, in other currencies in 2023. And we're also seeing continued record-breaking gold purchases by central banks, with China leading the way. Now, before we get into gold, and we will, but before we get into that gold, let's focus on the black gold angle, which is oil. And last time we spoke, you said that the Saudis joining BRICS would be of huge significance to the petrodollar status. Well, now they have joined. They've joined BRICS Plus, and collectively the group produces about 44% of the world's crude oil. And part of what keeps the dollar as the global reserve currency is its status as the petrodollar, with most oil transactions worldwide conducted in dollars. And this dates back to a milestone pact signed between President Nixon and the Saudi King Faisal back in 1974. So, Andy, firstly, for our viewers that are not 100% clear on this concept, explain the idea of the petrodollar and why oil being priced in dollars is so important.
Yeah, sure. Well, it was the deal, as you mentioned, that was struck in 1974, whereby for the protection of the Saudi kingdom and by extension OPEC, the promise was to value oil globally, price oil globally in dollars, and to recycle those profits into U.S. treasuries. And for that, that protection, then, the dollar would be the king. It would be every country on the planet would be required to purchase dollars or to stockpile dollars in order to purchase oil. And it has created a synthetic demand, in essence, for the past 50 years, and arguably has allowed us to live perhaps even above our due standard of living. And I think people need to understand that the fact that the dollar has been for 50 years the standard by which every country on the planet buys oil is an exorbitant privilege, and one that I think should be nurtured and clung to and not really be pushed away the way that this administration has really done a very good job at doing.
Right. And of course, this also happened after Nixon took the US dollar off the gold standard, but sort of replaced it in a way with this petrodollar status, which maintained dollar supremacy. And as you've just explained, it's so important for the US dollar in maintaining its global reserve status. But you're saying that we are now at an inflection point and we're seeing an acceleration of countries not selling oil in dollars. Break that down for us.
Absolutely. I mean, you're seeing all of these bilateral deals that are being made between countries that are, as JP Morgan says, 20% of oil sales not in US dollars. Well, it's for the last 50 years, it's been north of 85, 90, even closer to 100% of all oil sales have been priced in US dollars. And it is this synthetic demand that gives the dollar its strength, its global strength, and its global demand. And what we've seen over the last several years is this push away from the dollar hegemony. And look, the fact that we told the world and Saudi Arabia that we are going green and wrote an executive order attesting to that is something that people need to understand is arguably the beginning of the end of the petrodollar as we know it. And I don't think people quite understand the ramifications of it. But as I mentioned to you offline, I'm very fond of a term called logarithmic decay, which speaks to little by little by little by little by little, then all at once. It's almost like going over a waterfall where you see the pitch of the water starting to get steeper and steeper and steeper until you fall off the cliff. And so I'm not saying that this is going to happen today or tomorrow. It could, but what I am saying is that we are witnessing little by little by little by little by little, the chipping away at the dollar hegemony. I mean, let's look at the fact that, for example, every single OPEC country, all of them, are on the Chinese Belt Road and Rail Initiative, the largest infrastructure project in human history. Let's look at the fact that Saudi Arabia indeed did just join BRICS and was formally admitted 2 days ago. Let's look at the fact that Saudi Arabia did indeed join the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is the largest regional financial and military organization on the planet. And they joined the BRICS New Development Bank. You can see where they're going, but what became very provocative to me is what we are witnessing here right now. And that is they told the folks at the World Bank meeting earlier this year that, yeah, you know what, we are interested in listening to other countries who want to buy oil in other currencies. And this is a very, very big deal. And when you look at the coalition of countries, so you mentioned the size of the BRICS in and of themselves right now, it's growing in significance. In fact, this year alone, the BRICS countries are responsible for more GDP globally than are the G7. Just a little bit, but it's beginning and growing, as is their union. But when you put together these groups, the Belt Road Initiative, which as in and of itself is responsible for close to 75% of human population and 50% of global GDP, along with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the Eurasian Economic Union, who the president of Belarus says needs to all join BRICS because they're largely the same countries with the same goals and ambitions. And you put that together with BRICS, you're talking the majority of human population, north of 85% of human population, the majority of global GDP, the two of the three largest nuclear arsenals on the planet, and the stranglehold on the majority of the world's natural resources, energy in particular. So yeah, this is a big deal, Michelle, and it's not one to take lightly as far as I'm concerned.
Right. And you also mentioned when we spoke offline, reports that didn't get much coverage in Western media, but that the United Arab Emirates said that it is not selling oil in dollars. There were a couple of articles about this, one in MSN, but it didn't really get much coverage, which in itself is quite interesting. Perhaps it means that it wasn't an accurate statement, or perhaps there's an intention to downplay this. But there are other sources saying that the UAE is looking at individual oil and gas deals with up to 15 countries, not in dollars, in their own currencies, including China, Russia, and Egypt, which are now all the BRICS members here. How significant do you think the statement from the UAE, if indeed is accurate, is?
Yeah, and I agree with your assessment. I mean, it was strange that you can't find a lot on it, but maybe it has something to do with that this statement. Well, first of all, let's look at the UAE. They're the 7th largest producer of oil in the world. They are a OPEC member. They were just admitted, along with Saudi Arabia, into the BRICS, and now are full-fledged members of the BRICS. But the ironic part of all of this is that supposedly 2 days or so before the United Nations meeting 2 weeks ago in Dubai, where 200 countries were coming to the United Arab Emirates to discuss climate change. And the funny thing about it, it was presided over by the owner, or the head of, rather, the chief of the United Arab Emirates state-owned oil company. And where he told the former president of Ireland, you know, listen, I'm just saying if we go away from fossil fuels, you're going to send civilization back to the Stone Age, back to the caves. But what's interesting about it is that maybe the downplay was the fact that this announcement was made 2 days before 200 countries come to the UAE on climate change. Hey, we're not going to take dollars anymore. What becomes even more provocative is the fact, and here's another story that didn't get much attention, is that Putin, who hasn't really left his country but once or twice over the last few years because of the bounty on his head, just makes a very impromptu trip to the United Arab Emirates, flanked by 4 Russian MiG fighter jets. Now, what do you think he said to him? Do you think he said, listen, you know, other countries have made that statement, like Gaddafi with Libya and Hussein with Iraq, and certainly we know what became of their fate, so we've got your back. And then the day after that, he goes to Saudi Arabia, where the announcement of OPEC is we're going to increase the reduction in oil output from 1 million to 2 million barrels. So you have to ask yourself what was said, what was reassured. And again, you know, assuming that this is true, it's a very, very, very big shot across the Western bow. Now, it's not quite as provocative as that ultimate moment, as we've discussed before, where all of OPEC says, hey, you know, look, you guys are going green, thanks for the memories, or Saudi Arabia making that comment, but it's one step removed, and it's something, again, that should not be taken lightly whatsoever. And when you look at the countries that have been admitted, there, as you mentioned, there's actually 20 countries that have formally applied and up to another 20 that have informally applied. Every single one of them has one thing in common for sure, and that is they are very, very rich in natural resources, in particular energy, or the rare earth metals needed to make batteries, or precious metals, or all of the above, and also very, very, very tied into strategic shipping lanes like the Red Sea, like the Straits of Hormuz. And if these countries that are on the list actually do become BRICS members, they will control the Straits of Hormuz and the Red Sea, and they will control very strategic shipping lanes. And they have the new BRICS Naval Alliance, where a lot of these countries are banding together to patrol the Indian Ocean and perhaps ultimately the Red Sea, where, you know, you have the U.S. Navy, who's been doing all of that heavy lifting for a while. But ironically, whether you're talking the Belt Road Initiative or you're talking the BRICS, I think the president of Iran said it best. He says the most important problem is represented by three issues. The first is energy production. Okay, they got that covered. The second is energy transfer. Okay, got that covered. That's the shipping lanes and whatnot. And the third is energy consumption. And when you talk about these three issues, he says BRICS has solved that. And they are indeed, this is their very methodical plan where they're doing it little by little by little by little by little. Look, Jim Rickards is a man I respect a lot, Michelle, and he made the statement this last summer that in the meeting in Johannesburg that he would expect two things to happen, both of which I agree with, mind you. One, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the Eurasian Economic Union would join BRICS. Well, the president of Belarus is calling for a summit to do just that. Didn't happen in August. He got a little pushback. That's okay. The second thing he talked about was that they would issue a common settlement currency. Now, the difference between a settlement currency and a reserve currency is you can trade in something, but when you have excess, what do you do with it? So it's always gone into U.S. Treasuries, the most stable liquid market in the world, although that hasn't worked out so well for them over the last year or two. But the bottom line is simply this. I think that there will indeed, because that didn't come to fruition, so the finance ministers were tasked with going back to the drawing board and coming back to the meeting in Russia in October and presenting their findings. It will happen. After all, gold was reclassified the only other tier one asset in the world by the BIS in 2019. And lo and behold, is it a coincidence that the world's central banks, largely these countries that we're talking about, have bought more gold over the last 2 years than any time in central bank history? There will be a moment, just like the Russian finance ministers promised us, where they issue a common settlement currency. And I think it will be pegged to commodities using blockchain technology to show the veracity and the immutability. But at some point, the chipping away of the settlement of the dollar will affect the reserve status. Now, I don't know that you need to have a vibrant bond market like everyone speaks to, because the whole concept of bonds and taking and accepting a country's debt as an asset in a historical perspective, it's not real long in the tooth. In other words, it's kind of, from an historical perspective, not something that has been going on forever. And what you're seeing right now, and maybe it's a little bit of precursor of what we could expect to see, a lot of these countries like China and Japan and Saudi Arabia and a lot of the countries in the BRICS, they're shedding treasuries at record levels and replacing it with gold. So the bond market issue, the reserve status issue, well, that's still a little bit murky and up in the air. But I do believe there will come a common settlement currency tied to a basket of commodities. And in particular, I believe it will be gold. Right.
And in fact, Andy, you were one of the first people that we spoke to really articulate that thesis, that the global monetary system will be divided and challenging the dollar will be a commodity-backed currency, potentially in the form of some digital blockchain-based currency. I want to unpack that idea further, even though we have chatted about that before. But before we get to that, want to discuss some of the developments that you see taking us there. And again, you've mentioned this idea of logarithmic decay and, slowly but suddenly, little by little. But if we just look at the change that's happened since you first planted this idea, at least to Kitco viewers in January of 2023, how much change we've seen in that time, that is really very rapid. Now, since then, we spoke, as I mentioned, in August, and you said that you saw the Saudis as the linchpin here. And you just mentioned that we did, in fact, hear from the Saudis at the World Economic Forum in 2023, saying that the country was open to talking about settling trades using other currencies other than the dollar, which, of course, a very provocative statement. And last year, China eclipsed the U.S. as the Saudi Arabia's biggest trading partner. So with the Saudis being the linchpin here, are you looking to see a statement or action from the Saudis? I mean, they're still selling oil in dollars, correct? Or are they currently accepting other currencies?
Well, they accept other currencies also. They've been selling to China in the yuan, the petro yuan, which is a bond that is immediately convertible into gold on the Shanghai Gold Exchange. What is gold? Tier one reserve asset. So I think indeed that they are striking deals with other countries. And, who knows how forthright they are to the international community about what what those deals really represent. But indeed, I think you could say that the beginning of the end of the U.S. hegemony is becoming obvious all over the world. And certainly at some point, you will see the Saudis make that. Look, I want people to understand, and you and I had a little discussion about this, and I thought a lot about it, that I bleed for this country. I am a patriot. I am someone who represents the least likely character to achieve what I have. I came from nothing, literally 33 years ago. And my father and I started this company in a closet-sized office in Minneapolis from nothing, but a loan from a friend who, my dad's middle name is Miles. His best friend who lent us some money is Franklin. This country has presented me more opportunities than I could have ever dreamed of. But I have to tell you that I think indeed we are heading down a very, very dangerous path. And when I say that I admire the way the BRICS are doing this, understand that I admire it from a standpoint of being strategic. Now, I think that the problem with the U.S. is that instant gratification isn't fast enough. And that's why James Rickards got so much crap. And people were saying, oh, it's a nothing burger and this and that. When I was doing podcasts, no, indeed it's not. What it is, and I believe what James said will happen. And it's just that they do things the right way. This is not a shotgun phenomenon. They've been doing this for 17 years already. And it is accelerating now. Indeed, it is accelerating. But what you are witnessing, like if we talk cryptocurrencies, is mass adoption, right? So they went from 5 countries to now 10 countries, and now another 20 have formally applied, and then another 20 have expressed interest. At what point does it become substantial enough in every metric? Military, GDP, natural resources, shipping lanes, human population, you name it. Yeah. At what point does it become really substantial enough to then they flip the switch? Yes, we're going to make that switch where there ain't nothing you can do about it. And I think that's the methodical part that eventually I think we'll see.
Okay, so a couple of points to bring up from that, including whether the expansion is necessarily a good thing for a coalition that may have more to disagree on. But before we answer that, and I do want to answer that, but before that, flipping the switch, I want to be clear what you think the key moment is. Is it the Saudis taking a step as bold as refusing the dollar for oil, at some point saying we only accept this new common currency? What does that flipping of the switch actually look like?
Look, these BRICS nations wouldn't even have to do something that provocative, although I think they may. They could say one of two things. They could say we're taking other currencies besides dollars, and just that admission alone.
But they've said that. They've practically said that.
They said we're open to it, but they haven't said we're going to. We'll take these 5 or 6 currencies. Or maybe it's more along the lines of they just say to all of the BRICS members, which represent the majority of human population, is that we're going to trade in local currencies, or we're going to trade in gold, or whatever it may be. If the desire or the need to hold US dollars is waning to that degree, or in fact, is completely disincentivized, it creates a massive, massive problem for the U.S. And I think, look, a country that has chosen inflation over austerity the way that we have, a country that is, when you factor in unfunded liabilities, 150 trillion in the hole with 5 trillion in assets, a country that is in essence insolvent, that goes around the word bullying people and doing things in a coercive manner, I think is incentivizing the world to find alternatives. And that's just it, is that, yes, all people say, well, the dollar and the U.S. bond market is the cleanest dirty shirt in the laundry hamper. But I think that's where gold comes into play. I think that's where blockchain technology comes into play.
And that's why I want to get clear on this flipping of the switch, because we are already seeing these countries saying we're going to trade in our own currencies and doing so. We're already seeing oil being sold for dirham and for rupees and for rubles and for petro yuan converted into gold. It's already happening. So again, what is that sort of watershed moment that makes that switch flip irreversibly? What is that? An
outright admission, an outright statement from OPEC. We're not taking dollars anymore. I mean, Brazil just applied to OPEC. You have the majority of all of the oil production in the world, if they say we don't want dollars any longer, it creates a very, very, very big problem.
Why would they do that? Why would they say we don't want dollars anymore?
Well, because, I mean, look at what happens if you end up on the wrong side of the Western ideology. You can have your assets frozen. And in fact, even in the case of what's now being discussed, is to confiscate those assets and use them to rebuild the Ukraine. Look at what we did to Iraq. We went in there under a false pretense 20 years ago, and we're still occupying their country. They made $90 billion in oil revenue last year. They asked the government this year for $1 billion, and we said no. Really?
But Andy, is moving away from dollars the same as saying we're no longer using dollars? I mean, I can see from the BRICS Plus perspective the incentive to reduce the reliance on the dollar. And as we discussed, the weaponization of it certainly hasn't helped. But why go to the extreme of saying we're not accepting dollars at all?
Because I think, Michelle, there's a large portion of the world, much larger portion of the world than is found here in North America, that is tired of 500 years of Western dominance and suppression and coercion. And I think that this is the rallying cry that's bringing everyone to the table, that people want to I think, have the standard of living and not be told how to do things. This rule-based order where we're the ones setting the rules and everyone else has to follow by them. And when you see the way all of these countries are pushing back against the West and our ideological viewpoints maybe don't mesh so well with a large portion of the world, but a lot of these countries who may have felt this way haven't had the ability to do this in and of themselves on their own. Like a country like Venezuela, who has the largest known oil reserves in the world, they just formally applied to BRICS. So you find safety in numbers, and I think that's kind of what it is. This is our shot to have the life that we want and to do it under our terms. And they are finding safety in numbers, I believe. So not to mention that, I mean, look at it this way. Why would you want to sell your oil for dollars, a currency that is being inflated away, literally, as we sit here and watch it literally lose value precipitously? Why would they want to do that? And then reinvest them into treasuries that have been a disaster. And then if you don't do what they tell you to do, or you end up doing something to defend, in your mind, your own interests, your own political, or rather your own border interests or your safety interests, whatever it is. And I'm not, this isn't about, what Putin did was right or wrong, or what Iraq did was right or wrong. These are sovereign countries that are deciding to do what they want to do. And if it falls on the wrong side, well, you're going to get your assets frozen. You're going to get kicked out of SWIFT. You're going to become blacklisted. And I think that is really resonating with a lot of countries around the globe.
On the safety in numbers, the flip side of that, Andy, is a bigger alliance makes it harder to come to unity. It makes it harder for the BRICS group to have cohesion in ideology and decisions. I mean, some of the members in the group already aren't exactly ideologically aligned or already have a lot of geopolitical conflict areas. India and China, for example, they're not on the same page on a number of issues. They've got border disputes, trade issues. We had back in September, China's president, she's skipping the G20 summit held in India, which was seen as a setback to India and China ties. I mean, Saudi Arabia and Iran, yes, thanks to a Chinese brokered arrangement, they are looking at resuming diplomatic ties, but they're certainly historically arch enemies there with major religious and ideological differences, regional influence. Although it sounds as though that relationship may be back on track, or as I say, the resumption of ties with that Chinese brokered deal, Iran has just this week suspended flights to Saudi Arabia that were set to restart, due to what they called technical disagreements. So they're already struggling to make good on, the basics of that deal brokered by China. When you have more and more countries, and I just give those as examples, right? But when you have more and more countries that are not really aligned. I mean, India, for example, said that they weren't so sure they wanted a common currency because they're enjoying the recent strength of the rupee. When you have all of these countries together, isn't it harder to find agreement and to cooperate?
Absolutely it is, of course. I mean, and that's just in any large group. But look, my enemy's enemy is my friend. You know, there was a report that wasn't well publicized, but you'll find it if you look, and that is that, you know, Xi Jinping and Modi met on the sidelines at the summit and basically said that, look, we will do all we can to resolve our border disputes. Of course, you mentioned Iran and Saudi Arabia and building embassies in each other's countries, and the first railway and road being built between Iran and Iraq. And look, it's not going to be easy, but that's why I believe when you have a system like they are set up, or they're setting up or have set up, it lends itself to cooperation in the respect that the presidency, as an example, rotates each year. You mentioned it goes to Russia, just left South Africa. Each year, the main countries then get to take over the presidency. And I think the way that you resolve that is to not make any one country a dominant central figure. And that's where blockchain and that's where commodities that are pegged to a blockchain come into play, to give everyone equal voice, equal footing, equal say at the table. Mm-hmm. Look, I would simply say this. When you look at the way things are being done, in large part, and the Belt Road Initiative is a good example, they are being done in a mutually cooperative manner where, you know, everyone is winning in the endeavors of increasing the infrastructure, of building bridges and roads and maritime channels and building oil refineries and gold and silver mines and all of the things that help these countries industrialize. It's not going to be easy, certainly not, but I do believe it will be one that will be built on cooperation. And the very fact, yes, they may have suspended flights over a technical issue, but again, you know, this is not something that you can just snap your fingers and say, okay, it's all fixed, but you can see the drive to make it work. And look, if countries don't agree with the US, we just come in and we do things in a more coercive manner. These countries are at least trying to do it diplomatically. I'm not saying that this is going to be something that will be easy, but what I am saying is that for the first time in history, there is a coalition forming. And if done the right way, using transparency, using commodities, using mutual beneficial tactics, where no one country rules the roost, then indeed, I think it has a very, very strong probability of working, at least working out their differences enough to allow them to, at least try and reach their ultimate goal, and that is of having a group of countries that is not beholden to the West and to the West's ideology.
Right. I mean, you know, one of the counters to that is that China makes up the vast majority of the BRICS GDP and will want to exert undue influence at some point. And to be clear, you know, I like to push back on you, Andy, not because I necessarily disagree, but I always like to play devil's advocate and bring up counter arguments here.
Well, let me answer that real quick. And I'm sorry to interrupt you. Yes, they may. They make everything, right? They're the engine of manufacturing and whatnot. But look at all the countries they're aligning with. They're the countries who have all the raw materials. They're the countries who have all of the energy. So this is a deal where not everyone will be equal in terms of what they bring to the table or their ability to produce things, or, you know, some may have the raw materials, some may be the engine of manufacturing, some may be more along the lines of distribution, or whatever it may be. I just think that this is something that for the very first time, there's a shirt inside the hamper that maybe doesn't smell as bad as people think. And I just think that it's something that it should not be. And that's why I think it's very important to use the term logarithmic decay, little by little by little by little, chipping away at the dollar hegemony. And to guys like Brent Johnson, who have been right, and I agree with him and his dollar milkshake theory, it still is the currency. But what you are witnessing are very valid attempts to disrupt that. Right. And my question is, when does that happen? Nobody knows. But to your point earlier, it is accelerating, Michelle, and I think that's something that's hard to dispute.
It's your point, Andy. I'm just giving the facts and the data to back up your point that we're seeing an acceleration. And again, you said that the Saudis joining the BRICS would be a major point of acceleration. And it's a very interesting move, actually, because at the same time, Mohammed bin Salman has said that Saudi Arabia wants Middle East stability and to focus on modernization and economic development, and he wants to turn Saudi Arabia into a global business hub by 2030. They've even embraced certain green initiatives with the city of Neom. He's been working to calm conflicts and tensions across the Middle East. And Saudi Arabia and the US were very close to securing a new defense pact before the war between Israel and Gaza put those talks on hold. KSA also reportedly was in talks to normalize relations with Israel and believed that that was a factor in the timing of the October 7th terrorist attacks by Hamas, an Iranian-backed terrorist proxy, which was intended to derail that. So I get the significance of Saudi Arabia joining the BRICS on the surface, but it still seems to me, Andy, that the Saudis are playing both sides here. And,
as they should.
And to that end, maybe them joining BRICS is not necessarily such a big deal because they may not be taking any real aggressive actions, at least not anytime soon. It feels like they may still be waiting to see how does Russia-Ukraine war, play out. They may still be, as I say, not fully backing away from any kind of Western alliance. So is it really... Yeah, okay, go ahead then.
Well, that's what I've been saying. They're doing things methodically. Just like, you could say the same thing about Turkey, who's a NATO member who just formally applied to BRICS because the European Union turned them down. There's no reason to burn bridges until you're ready to blow up the bridge, if indeed that's what they do. But I think this will be something that it has to be done very diplomatically, very methodically. And it's something that it would be foolish for them to make these very provocative moves without having everything in place. And that's what I mean by mass adoption. That's what I mean about developing an ecosystem that will allow these countries to compete on many levels with the settlement status of the US dollar. We're not talking reserve yet, but the settlement status, which, enough settlement is done in other currencies, and unions and trust that comes over time manifests into a much more stable union. And that's when you see those types of moves being made, where there is the flip being switched. Mike Adams, the health ranger, would call it Project Operation Sandman, where he believes there's already 150 countries that have agreed, or somewhere in that neighborhood, agreed to dump the dollar in unison at one point. But what is that one point? When are they ready to do that? When is the critical mass? When do they have enough influence on multiple levels to make that trade or to make that move? I don't know. But Michelle, to me, you don't see these types of moves that are accelerating in these relationships, that are accelerating in the right. verbiage that we hear, the rhetoric that we hear, without there being something very substantial behind it. And again, I have a curse, and my curse is I see things, always have, I think, long before they happen. And I don't think you have to be a rocket scientist to put all of this together and see it. Now, what is the fuse that ignites it? What is the springboard or the impetus that makes that moment where countries forsake the dollar? I don't know what it is or when it is, but I will tell you, I honestly do believe that this is the ultimate goal. And when you put it into context with an administration whose, as we've talked about before, main economic advisor, his whole thesis, Jared Bernstein, is to lose the reserve status and look at weaponizing the dollar. Look, if the reserve status was so important to us, then why the hell would we tell Saudi Arabia and the rest of the world we're going green when it is the linchpin to the dollar hegemony, the petrodollar? But we're going green, so it's all right, you guys. We're going a different direction. And the countries that they are uniting with, which represent the majority of human population, are the ones that have all of the world's oil and natural gas and rare earth metals and all of the things that you need to build an advanced society. So it just doesn't make sense. Right.
And we've spoken about Jared Bernstein before. We'll cover that again. But before we do that, again, you make very, very valid points just as a counter argument a lot of this is dependent on the leaders of the country. Now, most of these countries have leaders for life. If we look at President Xi, for example, and Mohammed bin Salman certainly isn't going anywhere, as are the leaders of the UAE rather. But some of the countries do have elections, and we saw the example of Argentina, where they had a change in leadership, and the new president there, Javier Milei, withdrew Argentina from its planned entry into the BRICS. He said that those decisions were made by the previous government, and he's revising that move, and he sent a letter saying he didn't consider it appropriate for Argentina to become a full BRICS member, but was still committed to strengthening bilateral ties, particularly with the aim of increasing trade and investment flows, which is a responsible statement to make from any leader. But in the past, he's been very critical of China. And on the campaign trail, he described the Chinese government as assassins and said he would not work with communists. Now, beyond the example of Argentina, if this does take time, you do have the idea of changed leadership and changed sentiment, and perhaps people not that willing to forsake a Western alliance. So what do you make of those kind of developments?
Well, I think it's fair. I mean, look at the knuckleheads in the White House right now. Between President Biden and Vice President Harris, between the two of them, they have a hard time getting 10 words together that are coherent. I get it. And there'll be a regime change one way or the other. I get it. This isn't going to be easy whatsoever. But nonetheless, it continues. And, you know, I think it represents the lesser of two evils to a lot of these countries. Mm-hmm. And I just think that little by little by little, we will continue to see the de-dollarization. Look, we are a country that's broke. We are a country that's insolvent, where the Congressional Budget Office of the United States government said in 7 years, by 2031, every single penny in tax revenue will go just to pay the interest on the debt and mandatory entitlement spending like Social Security, which is nearly $70 trillion in the hole. $1 trillion seconds ago was 31,688 years ago. We are at 130% debt to GDP, and there's no country that has ever come back from that without defaulting or hyperinflating. We are not in a position, I think, on many levels, to be able to be the dominant superpower that we are. And again, I want it to be understood that this is not what I'm rooting for. This is not something that I relish. I have 3 kids. My youngest is 16. I am frightened for the world that she's growing up in. And I would just simply say to you that, you know, one-off country like Argentina saying we're out is replaced by 20 who say we're in. And, you know, at some point, the legitimacy grows. If the union that they are building is one of mutual benefit and respect, yeah, I understand what you say about Xi Jinping. People say, who's going to trust China? But let me ask you this honestly, and you don't have to answer it. I'm asking all of you out there. After what we've seen over the last year or two with this current administration, do people really trust us like they used to? Do people really believe that Lady Liberty with the blindfold holding the scales of justice, do they believe that those scales are balanced the right way? That the current administration and the previous have been treated the same? Do people really look at this country with our elections being called into question, where the last time someone was taken off of the ballot was Abraham Lincoln and it resulted in a civil war? Do people really believe that the open border problems that we have, the divisiveness in this country, the fact that red and blue can't even talk anymore, do people really believe that we are trustworthy the way that we always have been? And I wonder if that's creeping into the collective psyche of many of these countries around the world who are left with the decision, what do we do? So, you know, I like your pushback, and I agree with a lot of it, but I will simply say, to me, it doesn't stop this trend in motion. And I think a trend in motion stays in motion until it stops. And I don't see it stopping anytime soon.
And again, Andy, the pushback is not necessarily because I disagree. It's for the intellectual exercise of letting you counter some of the arguments that one could put forward.
You keep me on my toes. I love it. I do.
And look, I agree that, you know, in many ways, faith in the United States is eroding on the global stage, for sure, and certainly domestically as well. That there have been certain actions taken by this administration that are making people question a lot of the values that the United States is supposed to represent. Having said all of this, I would still counter with many saying, and I know you have a theory that this is by design, but for the factions within the US that enjoy the fact that the US is the global reserve currency, and I'm sure that there are many in the establishment that would want to maintain that position, would the US really allow this? Would there not be some kind of military action or war taken to prevent this? And keeping in mind, we're already, in a way, seeing one proxy war between Russia and Ukraine, and we could be seeing escalation in the Middle East, perhaps as a way to counter this. Is that something that you see as a likely scenario? Military action by the US to try and prevent this, a way to exert US-American might and prowess on the global stage. And I'm not saying the Biden administration wants to do this, but is this something that you see as a potential scenario that could derail this development?
Yeah, I mean, I think you could obviously, you start meddling in people's affairs. Thomas Jefferson warned us of that a long time ago. Stay the hell out of people's affairs. But you do. You know, Xi Jinping has told the world that he will stop at nothing to reunite China. Okay, fine. But we are meddling in people's affairs that we shouldn't be meddling in. And it's one thing to talk about Israel. We have a promise and a pact with them. It's another thing to start meddling in the Ukraine and to sit right there and foster, you know, United or NATO memberships with countries surrounding Russia that were promised never would be. It's that we are meddling in people's affairs in terms of military. But look, I would simply say this to you, that there are too many things that are being done to make me feel otherwise. I mean, and what would the reason be, I guess, is the question you're asking. We are a country that is broke, insolvent, and how do you pay back that debt? What do? You just, you know, my mentor, Richard Russell, always used to say that, and this was 15 years ago, that the Fed is screwed and they have two choices: inflate or die, inflate or default, print or die. What about option number 3, find a villain? You incentivize these folks by weaponizing the dollar, telling Saudi Arabia and the rest of the OPEC countries, hey, we're going green. We don't need you anymore. And then you create massive divisiveness in this country. You create a situation where what it means to be an American, what inspired people, even probably like yourself when you were young, to dream of being an American is no longer maybe the vision or the thought that it once was. And you inspire this type of union that is being born. And if indeed they did make the switch where, hey, you know what? We don't like the prospects of a currency that is indebted as you are, with you know, really no prospect of ever paying that back other than inflation and inflating away the currency, and you blur the metrics by which inflation is gauged, we're going to go a different direction. And if that indeed happens and the dollar gets globally dumped because they're no longer needed to be held or stockpiled, and they're losing value as some players start dumping, and then others, and then others, and then others, and all of a sudden the dollar starts to really get crippled and lose value, and they hit our shores, creating a massive increase in the amount of dollars that hit our shores because there's way more outside the country than in, as the stockpiling of dollars to buy oil has necessitated that. The byproduct of that is spiked interest rates to the moon to compensate for that inflation, which then blows up not only stocks, bonds, and real estate and the dollar, but the banking system as well. And have no fear, Lael Brainerd is here. She's a modern monetary theorist who was at the Fed, who worked with MIT in development of the new central bank digital currency that Biden signed into executive order that ushered in FedNow, which came out a few months ago, which is Venmo or Zelle on steroids, backed by the Fed. She's a modern monetary theorist. So if you bring everyone down to their knees because everything collapses, and it was those sons of bitches who did it to us, they did it to us. How could they? And remember, where's the debt go? Who do we owe all the debt to? Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and government military pensions. That $100+ trillion is owed to us. Who's buying all the bonds that the Chinese are no longer buying, that the Japanese are selling, Saudis are selling, Russia has already sold? All of these countries dumping bonds. Who's buying them all? Oh yeah, that's us. The hedge funds and the investors chasing yield. So if indeed there really was a plan to allow this to happen, the majority of the debt that we owe is to ourselves. A whole hell of a lot easier to issue as a modern monetary theorist a central bank digital currency to us and make us whole by signing on the dotted line and taking that CBDC, which many of the people watching this show would say, I ain't never taken that, until your bank blows up, your 401k blows up, everything blows up, and the federal government comes on at 6 o'clock at night and says, listen, we understand what's happened. We're very sorry. We're going to rein things in this country and be more protectionist of our own interests, and we're going to issue a new central bank digital currency. If you take it, you'll be made whole. Now, again, this is me trying to put all of these facts together and come up with a logical Occam's razor, call it, a logical outcome. But when the majority of the debt that we owe is to ourselves, it makes this whole situation a whole lot easier. And rather than pulling Bernanke and Janet Yellen and all of the former Fed and current Fed and Treasury chairs out and doing what happened to Marie Antoinette out in the town square, you can blame a villain. And that villain did this to us, inciting a rallying cry. So
Right.
am I trying to connect the dots? Sure I am. But look at all of the facts that are coming or pointing to something happening. And I think it happens long before 2031, when we have to borrow every single penny of discretionary spending to do anything, including funding our military, which is supposedly the biggest in the world. And we're yet, blowing off bombs like they're gumballs. It's a situation that I don't think can last under the current path that we are on right now. And something's going to break, whether it emanates from the BRICS or from within. And whether it's intended or not, I think the day of reckoning is coming.
Right. And again, I know we have discussed this at length, and we'll put the links to those discussions in the description of this video where we really broke it down. But just a couple of points to clarify for our viewers. Jared Bernstein, who you mentioned, he's the chairman of President Biden's Council of Economic Advisors, and he penned a very interesting op-ed in the New York Times back in 2014 titled "Dethrone King Dollar." And in it, Bernstein wrote that, and I quote, "New research reveals that what was once a privilege is now a burden. And to get the American economy back on track, the government needs to drop its commitment to maintaining the dollar's reserve currency status." And then again in 2018, Bernstein wrote another op-ed in the Washington Post stating that if one consequence of the Trump era is that the dollar loses some degree of its reserve status, I will consider that a good thing. And then he also added that we should be happy to shed the burden of the reserve currency status. So I just want to highlight that as the data behind the point that you make, that there are some people within the U.S. that could be pushing for the U.S. to lose its status as the global reserve currency, and then also pushing the idea of a central bank digital currency. And you combine those ideas, and you combine the idea of a great reset. And I get that that's how you've joined the dots to get to your theory there. So I do get that point. Also, just to clarify, the executive order signed by Biden regarding a central bank digital currency, it is to actively look at one, explore one. It has not yet been approved. And viewers of Kitco know that I'm very much against a central bank digital currency and like to keep our viewers updated with all of the efforts to push against it. Although, who knows, they may be futile, but there has been some resistance, at least from the Republican side, with regards to a central bank digital currency, which again, as a reminder to our viewers, is programmable fiat currency, which allows the government to see every single transaction made. There's zero anonymity, there's zero privacy, and the currency is programmable, allowing whoever's programming it to decide what transactions can and cannot be put through. And it also allows for, I guess you could say, fine-tuning monetary and fiscal policy just by, the click of a button. But I want to take it back, Andy, to the idea of the commodity-backed currency. Because back to the BRICS, you ultimately think that that is still the goal and that is still on track. Do you have an approximate timeline for that? Is that something we could hear in earnest at this meeting in Russia later this year?
It certainly is. I mean, look, even the West acknowledges that. I mean, Kristalina Georgieva, the head of the IMF, in the report they wrote right around the time that you and I had our interview in Vancouver, gold a barbarous relic, or gold an international reserve currency, barbarous relic no more, something to that extent. And then she came out a few months ago and said any central bank digital currency not pegged to something is fiat. Well, what would it be pegged to? And when you talk about could this happen in October in Russia? Sure, it could, absolutely. And I think the way that they would do it, because see, President de Gaulle, who drained a good portion of the gold from our treasury in 1970, 1971, proved that convertible currencies convert. So what blockchain does is allow the immutability and the veracity of which each country pegs to be there without having it convertible. In other words, maybe you peg 10% or 20% of each currency unit to gold held on the blockchain and audited by independent international auditors. You can do that if you are open and transparent and do it the right way. You still have the ability to transact monetary policy because it's not a one-to-one, but a small percentage, but just enough to tether it, because given the choice, politicians will do what all politicians have done forever. Even going back to Roman times when they clipped the coins, that's why there are ridges on the side of gold coins, because they would clip it and make it just a little bit smaller. You do that enough, you have enough to make more coins. Well, going back to the beginning of money, politicians will choose inflation over austerity. So yeah, I think this is how you give it credibility in a system that I believe has already lost a good amount of credibility, in fact, and is losing it rapidly across the globe. So yes, the marriage of blockchain and the marriage of commodities together inspires confidence. And that's why when people say, who's going to trust? Well, you don't have to. If you do it the right way and have it audited, have it transparent, and everyone pledges the same thing to the distributed ledger, to the blockchain, you got a real fighting chance. And you asked me when we were in Vancouver, well, what could the West do? And I brought up Kristalina Georgieva's report. And at that point, she hadn't made the comment. But now she has. And she said a CBDC not pegged to something is fiat. Well, how does the West maybe stop this? How does the West maybe pull up from this nosedive? Do that. Get some legitimacy and credibility back into this system, one that is lacking it and is lacking trust. And indeed, you talk cryptocurrency again. It's about confidence. If you have no confidence in whatever it may be, then you're waiting for a rug pull. You're waiting for something to collapse. And I think no one will drink the Kool-Aid ever again the next time around, unless it is pegged to something with transparency. Zoltan Pozar calls this Bretton Woods 3, a system that will be dominated by commodities and transparency. This is the way to do it without having it convertible immediately by anyone who walks into a bank like they could do back here when this $20 gold certificate was the same thing as a $20 coin. And it's funny because now it says in God we trust, but back then, before 33, it says payable to the bearer on demand in gold coin. So it used to be one-to-one conversion. I don't think you'll see that again. But what gold will do when it marries with blockchain is to show exactly what every country has in the union, pegged to the system, giving them equal say at the table, and using blockchain technology to show the immutability of it. I think it is what they're thinking. But I guess only time will tell now, Michelle. And I guess we'll have to see. Right.
So not redeemable for gold, but just using the blockchain system to verify that the gold is actually there. And Andy, to that end, we have seen central banks buying gold at record rates. 2022 was a record year for central bank gold purchases. 2023, according to the World Gold Council, is also set to be an even bigger year for gold purchases. The World Gold Council expects central bank gold purchases to have hit a new record in 2023. And guess who's buying the most gold? It's China. China has been...
How much of that are they not telling us? How much of it are they buying that they're not telling us? I agree.
And that's at least what they're admitting to. China has been adding gold to its reserves for the past 12 months in a row, and at least that's what they're openly admitting to. So you're saying that you do think it's likely, possible. What percentage of likelihood would you ascribe to the idea of this commodity-backed common currency coming from the BRICS really taking a step forward in 2024?
I don't know that it happens in 2024, but I would say it's damn near close to 100% that it does happen. That is what they are intending to do, barring any unforeseen events. It is how you gain legitimacy. When people say, who's going to trust Russia or China, they'll say, look at the European Union. It didn't work. Well, they didn't have the glue that holds it all together. And that glue would be a backing of something that is legitimate. And if you back just enough to inspire confidence, you still have the ability to expand the money supply, to do monetary things that, a 1-to-1 ratio wouldn't do. And I just think there is no way that these countries, because of all of the points that are fair and valid about China, about Russia, about all these countries, that I think it's important to look at the way the rest of the world looks at the United States when we make that comment. How do you think Iraq feels about the United States? Now, again, I'm a patriot. I love this country. I am not rooting for this to happen, but I'm saying when you look, if you are in an argument or you're in a debate class or you're an attorney, if you only focus on your argument and don't look at their argument, you're going to lose. And I think their argument is one that is compelling. And I think the only way to make it work, to take all of that out of the equation, the lack of trust in a new system based on who's backing it, well, fine, I agree with that. But what if you have a way to sidestep that? And that is to pledge what is now, according to the BIS, the only other tier 1 asset to something like that is immutable, like a blockchain, and show the veracity of it so you can't screw with it. It inspires confidence.
Do you see this? I get that point. I get that it inspires confidence, and that's very much needed. But do you see this as a gold-backed common currency or a common currency backed by a basket of commodities, including gold?
Well, the finance minister from Russia has always said basket. I've always reverted in my mind to gold. Why else would the BIS, after 70 years of it only being dollars and treasuries, say gold is now tier 1? To me, that's the ultimate. And I think the basket of commodities is difficult because of the characteristics that gold maintains. If you go back and look at, I think it's Aristotle's characteristics of money, 7 or 8 characteristics of money, that's what gold is. And it's not like you can have bushels of wheat pegged to the system or barrels of oil. I guess you could, but I think it would have to be rotated and all that kind of stuff. So ultimately, I would think it would be a gold-backed currency, but I can't say that for sure because that's in conflict with what the Russian finance minister has said candidly, that it would be a basket of commodities backing their new currency aspirations. So I don't know, but in my mind's eye, I see it being gold and primarily gold.
So having said that, and having just confirmed all of the data points that are moving in the direction of this happening and accelerating in 2024, we did see gold hit a new all-time high in 2023 of around, $2,148 an ounce on December 3rd. Right now, spot gold is trading at, $2,040. What's your outlook for gold in 2024?
Look, I mean, gold held up very well in the face of rising interest rates. And you can say what you want about the real interest rates and say what you want about the changing of the metrics by which we gauge interest rates. And I always tell people, go to John Williams' shadow stats. They'll tell you interest rate or inflation's at 10%. So, but let's just take the Fed at their word and say that, for the first time in a long time, that theory of real interest rates completely and totally derailing the gold rally was wrong. It held up incredibly well in the face of 11 straight increases in interest rates. And I think that when you realize that not only the most well-funded, but the most well-informed traders on the globe have been buying gold hand over fist for the last 2 years, it's very compelling. And then when you take a look at what's going on right now, well, and 2 more things really. One being, yeah, you're right, it did hit all-time highs on GLD. It did hit all-time highs on the London Metals Exchange, and yet it's completely zero hype globally about it, or at least in North America about it. Why is that? That doesn't make sense to me. I do believe that this year there will be an inflection point, or soon anyway, that the mainstream starts to realize what gold is and the virtues of it. Maybe it has to do with the bank bail-in, which most people don't even know what the hell that is, but it was written into law in the Dodd-Frank Act. But here's something that a lot of people aren't talking about, and I think it should be. And that is that if we go back to the 27th of December, just a few days ago, And I don't have what it was on gold, but I do have what it was on silver, but I can give you anecdotal evidence on gold. And that is the closing price of silver on the 27th on the Shanghai Gold Exchange, the Shanghai Metals Exchange, Gold Exchange, was $26.50 an ounce. And on the CME or the LBMA, it was $24.31. It's 10% higher in Shanghai. Now, gold has been trading as much as over $100 an ounce higher in Shanghai than it has on the LBMA and it has on COMEX. Slowly, methodically, little by little, turning up the heat, arbitraging all of the gold and silver that isn't nailed down. And so I think the bottom line is, look, from a technical standpoint, $2,000 was the resistance that could never be broken. Now it seems to be the floor. So I would expect things or the market to do well for gold here in 2024. But I think when people make predictions in a time frame, and Mr. Rickards, who I respect tremendously, I think he paid the price for doing that. I would just simply look at the macro and say, yeah, the chances of it happening, whether it be this year or next or the year after, is the probabilities are huge.
But you're ready to call a bottom at 2,000.
I would say that it from a technical standpoint, it represents a floor. Now, does that mean it could be broken? Look, if you look at what happened today and look at how the minute, right, of course, the day that there's, a Fed meeting, the minute it closed in Asia, and it was on the upswing in Asia, the minute it hit the corrupt AM and PM fix in London, bang, it just collapses. It hits COMEX open, bang, it collapses even more. What I'm getting at here is that the West controlling the metals price, where in a market right now, in terms of silver, it is rehypothecated 1,500%. There's 1,500% more paper contracts than there are bars backing. That's what the Hunt brothers noticed. And I think the legitimacy of an exchange that can price oil at negative 40 a barrel, or can smash the price of silver like that, where a levered futures market, the tail wagging the dog, controls the ultimate commodity price, is something that these countries right now deeply resent, but they're not bitching about it because they're the ones buying it all. And it is the price setting mechanism of the world for now. But wait until there's no metal or commodities, any of these price commodities that will be delivered at these stupid prices. And then watch how fast it shifts eastward. I think ultimately you'll see something like the Shanghai Gold Exchange or an exchange in Dubai take over for legitimate price setting rather than a COMEX market that allows rehypothecation and naked shorting, all of these things that are creating distortions in these commodities that I think are not real.
So where gold is not priced in dollars,
correct,
not denominated in dollars.
It won't be globally denominated in dollars, but the conversion back. You look at it this way: gold's at all-time highs almost against every currency on the planet right now. Has been for a while, but the dollar. No, the dollar's inordinate strength and the ability to suppress the markets to maintain the illusion of bond market strength and dollar strength has been what GATA has been talking about forever. And look, it's not a conspiracy. You got JP Morgan, who paid a $920 million fine and sent 3 of their traders to prison, including Michael Nowak, the head of their metals desk. So, fine line between conspiracy and reality.
There have been arrests, and we have had many guests on the show that have maintained that the gold and silver market are manipulated, certainly through futures contracts, and you just pointed out to some numbers there. As we start to wrap up here, Andy, I want to get your thoughts on what many say is a different alternative to losing faith in the US dollar, to point out all the same problems, but as a solution, they point to Bitcoin. What are your thoughts on Bitcoin?
I had a guy that worked for me. His name was Andy Hoffman. He was maybe the most prolific writer I've ever met. And he came to me many years ago, and Bitcoin was $300-400 an ounce. Then it started to really take off. And he said, listen, I have this idea of bridging the gap between, these new Bitcoin millionaires and old money gold. I said, that's a great idea. And our things didn't really work out so well. But the point of it is, since the day it came out, even though it was something that I didn't understand and owned a tiny, tiny bit of, I understood that we both, and as I was speaking with one of your associates before this interview, I said to her, Anna, they both came in through the same door. The people who buy Bitcoin and the people who buy gold, they come in through the same door of understanding. Where the divergence is that I think the people who buy gold are looking to preserve rather than to profit. And arguably, the people who own Bitcoin are looking more to profit than they are to preserve. So why not marry the two? Why not take some of your chips off the table when you make a gain and put it into gold? It doesn't have to be an either or, because the ideologic thought process to get to, push back against the mismanagement of the dollar, of inflation, of things that get people in through that door, they're the same or damn near close to it. Where we diverge is that I don't sell gold and silver to people to get wealthy. It is wealth and has been for 5,000 years through every pandemic and 2 world wars and German hyperinflation and the Great Depression. Every central bank on the planet nearly owns it. They're the ones buying it. So that should tell you something. But I don't disparage Bitcoin at all. In fact, I think it's intriguing, especially in light of what's happening to the dollar. So my advice to people would be, do not think either or. Do not be narrow-minded. Be more open-minded. And, I have a friend that I used to travel with. Our families would travel together. We'd always end up in casinos somehow when our kids would go to bed. And he would, every single time we left the casino, he cashed in at the cage with tons of money. I'm like, finally, I said, how the hell do you do that every time? I'm sitting there with you. I'm watching you. Where do you come with all this money? He says, every hand I win, Andy, I put a green chip in my pocket, $25 every time. And at the end of the night, he's got a pocket full of chips. And that's the analogy here. Bitcoin is very volatile. Look what it did today because of rumors that the SEC will not, that they're going to reject these applications for the Bitcoin exchange ETF, exchange traded fund. ETF,
yeah.
And bang, it went straight down. But it went straight up earlier in the year. So why not take some profit off the table and put it in old money to guarantee that when you leave the casino, you got money in your pocket to go to the cage and cash it out? That would be my advice to people. It's not either or. They're both important or should be both considered, and look at it as an either or rather than a one, and look at it as a combination, both rather than an either or.
But you still see Bitcoin very much as a speculative asset at this point and not as a store of value asset, given the volatility.
I think yes, it is speculative. I think ultimately people will look at it as a store of value, but you don't see a store of value go from 65,000 down to under 20,000. That's too volatile. But what it is it's an alternative to the fiat-based system. And for that, I respect it. And, Doug Casey made a phrase very popular, that one that I say all the time, and I give him credit for it because it's genius. And is that, gold and silver are assets that are not simultaneously someone else's liability. And in the world where counterparty risk is really growing, I think that will become an ugly word, ugly phrase, and maybe this year or soon with the banks failing and whatnot. I think Bitcoin, if held properly in a cold storage wallet or whatnot, is the same thing. And it's the removal of counterparty risk in a world where I think counterparty risk will be something that will dominate the news. Look, bail-ins are something people need to understand. Google it, read about it. And if a bank fails, it's supposed to be bailed in, which means you're an unsecured general creditor, and nobody in this country understands that. And they will understand very quickly how diabolical the phrase counterparty risk truly is. So I think there's a lot to be said for it, but I don't think it's the store of value that gold and silver are. But I do think it's maybe the next best alternative, and it's certainly going to make you probably a lot more money than gold and silver would if it goes to where people think. So take some of that profit and put it in money that's been considered money since the beginning of time, and that's a way to hedge your bet.
Right. Bail-ins, as you refer to, part of the Dodd-Frank rule, which does allow the bank to take assets from depositors over $250,000 if need be. We'll get into that discussion another time. We have talked about it in the past. But as we wrap up here, Andy, what do you say to those that say, you're talking your book, you sell gold, you sell silver, you're just creating a term that I've read in the comments of some of our videos, fear porn, to make people anxious, to make people uneasy, to sell more gold and silver? What do you say to that?
I mean, I think people who say that are immature and naive and have never built a business from scratch and believe, as jaded as they are, that capitalistic intentions and being good, doing the right thing have to be mutually exclusive? They don't. I come from nothing, Michelle. I mean, literally nothing. A $60,000 loan to start our company in 1990 from my dad's best friend in a closet-sized office. No one was saying that to me in the 90s when I could hear the crickets chirping at noon. And, we've done nearly 10 billion in sales. I ask myself all the time, why do I do this? Why do I get in front of our video that we did? The first one has 1.5 million views. Why do I do that? Put myself out there. I just did a video with General Flynn, and we all know what he's all about. A great patriot, but he's being watched. And does that mean I'm being watched? I don't know. Why do I do that? Why do I set myself up? Because I believe in it. And I believe in my company. We've never had a customer complaint. And if you want to buy gold and silver, buy from Kitco. I don't care. I just think that, look, if you want to make an argument, then you better be able to poke holes, or to make sure that you can't poke holes in it. And I look from every angle. And to me, it's the only really safe place to put your money that allows you privacy, liquidity, exodus from the matrix. And the bottom line is, anyone who's ever built a company from scratch, there's a certain part of talking your book, but if you don't really believe it, and you don't really come across, I hope, as sincere and genuine, I hope I do, you'll never be good at what you do. I don't care what it is. If you don't live it and breathe it and really believe it, then you're going to be poor to mid at very best. And I would like to think that that's not who I am. So I'm not talking my book. And as God is my witness, I believe it. In fact, there's probably nobody, and people who know me will tell you that, who believes it more than I do. And I've been buying gold and silver every 2 weeks for almost 34 years. And that was the promise I made my father when I started this company. It was the only rule. You'll buy something every 2 weeks. To me, it is not an investment. To me, it is wealth that I hope I never need to use. And if I do, I'm damn glad I have it. Not just when the sky falls. Maybe there'll be a hell of an opportunity at some point, and I can use it then. But if not, I know I'm leaving a lasting legacy to my family. Long after the dollar bills in our wallets are hanging from a frame in the Smithsonian, I believe gold and silver will still be eternal value and eternal wealth. So yes, I understand those people who are cynical who say he's talking his book, but to them, go start a company and then come back and tell me in a year or two if you really believe that's the truth. And this has been my life since I was 19 years old, and I'm 53. So no, I'm not talking my book, and I'm just trying to help as much I can.
Looking good for 53, Andy. And yes, you do make some very bold statements, which I can see could be counter to growing a business potentially. But we thank you for coming on and sharing your insights and sharing your opinions and taking the positions that you take, and always appreciate the fact that you allow me to try and poke holes in some of your arguments as well, even though I may not necessarily disagree at all, but always good to have a guest that's open to an intellectual challenge.
I've said it before. I admit, of all of the interviews I do, no one does that. You're the only one who does, and I respect the hell out of it. Because if not, you can expose really quickly the fraudulent side of an argument. I do. And whether or not you agree, the questions you ask are rooted in fact, and they're great. And I appreciate it. And I love coming on the show and welcome it anytime. And only sorry that I won't get to see you in Vancouver at the end of the month where we first met, but look forward to hopefully chatting with your associates and picking back up back where you and I left off, hopefully not too far down the road.
Team Kitco will be there. I personally will not, but there will be Team Kitco representing, and I'm sure they'd love to chat with you. Andy, we're going to wrap it up on this note of mutual appreciation. So again, thank you so much, Andy Schectman.
Michelle, thank you. Happy, healthy New Year to you and all the folks at Kitco and everyone out there. And stay well. Look forward to picking up where we left off real soon.
All right. Thank you, Andy. And while we're saying thanks, a special thanks to our sponsor, Swan Bitcoin. Now, Swan Bitcoin does, in fact, offer a service to high net worth individuals, businesses, and trusts. The Swan Private Team offers a comprehensive Bitcoin investment platform. They have services like institutional level liquidity, concierge over-the-counter service, inheritance and estate planning, tax loss harvesting, and more. That's just to name a few. It's a very hands-on service, and they help people understand Bitcoin and potentially capture the upside there. So check out the link. There is a special offer for Kitco viewers. Check out the link in the description of this video. As always, thank you for checking out our video. For me, Michelle Makori, and the rest of the team, we'll see you soon.
On the Spot with Michelle Makori is brought to you by Swan Bitcoin. Swan Private is proud to be your partner on the journey into Bitcoin. Swan Private helps high net worth individuals, family offices, businesses, and trusts. Expert service, real relationships. Go beyond legacy finance. Build your own legacy. Swan.com/wealth.